Hi, and welcome to CryptoBiography. I'm your host, Brandon Starr. This is episode, what is it, 232, wow, of CryptoBiography. And it is part one of a new story. It's going to be called The Isle of Bronze. And I've been thinking about this one for some time now. I don't remember if it was even before Snake Magic or if it sort of came up during it. Sometime around the beginning of it, though, and I've been thinking about it quite some time. And this is the first sort of time that I've actually got to sit down and write a bunch for it. I say write a bunch. The episode is actually going to be sort of regular length, but I wrote a lot of backgrounding this week in preparation for this, because this is going to be like a longer project than most. Probably longer than Snake Magic, I would imagine, if it turns out the way I'm thinking. However, like all my stories, I do want it to be created and sort of move forward organically. I don't want to force it to be longer than it needs to be, and I don't want to force it to be shorter. I would rather, the story be whatever length it needs to be. So I did a lot of backgrounding for it, some of which will probably, more or less make it into a show in the future. And some of which is probably, just going to be in my head, which is fine, because I need that sort of backgrounding for this sort of thing in order to make sure that I sort of keep everything on track and so forth. So we're actually starting this week with mythology and history. So I wrote, among other things, while I was backgrounding, I sort of wrote up sort of a mythology for this place. Like, this place has its own mythology, and this is part of it. I think it'll be clear for when I read this that this would be like sort of the basics of the mythology, and there would probably be many stories that these people would tell each other clearly, but this is sort of like the overarching story. It's kind of like if you were doing Greek mythology and you talked about Zeus and Olympus and the Titans and stuff like that. You wouldn't necessarily go right into Narcissus' story or whatever. You would you'd hit the big parts first, and then if you wanted to keep going along those lines, eventually you'd get to Narcissus and those sort of stories. So anyway, and I've got characters thought out and stuff like that. But anyway, this week it's the mythology of this place called the Isle of Bronze. At least that's the title of the story, and also some of its early history, sort of before the story that will be told probably starting next week. Although I might end up doing more history as well, because I'm definitely going to be doing some more backgrounding, and it's possible that turns into more history before we get to the actual part that I want to talk about. But I'm pretty sure though that next week we're going to get into more of a normal story. But anyway, I think that's plenty. That's more than plenty of introduction to this. I hope you enjoy it, and here we go. Father Earth and Mother Waters mixed in their love, but they were all alone. They loved each other's company, but they wanted more. So they mixed and made the fishes and the trees and the grass and the birds and the beasts. But they realized their error, for it was dark, and it was cold, and the living things they had created were not like them. They needed warmth, and most needed light. And so they mixed again, and their greatest child, the sun, was born. But the sun was too close, and it burned the beasts, and withered the trees, sizzled the grass. So they mixed again, and created the moon, a sibling for him, so he might go far into the sky, and yet not be lonely. But the sun and the moon did not get along well, and Brother Sun, who controlled the day and was very proud, mocked his sibling, neither brother nor sister, for the moon does not truly change, yet also never stays quite the same. They both circle far above their parents, rarely in the sky at the same time. Because of this relationship, when the moon moves in front of the sun, it is a moment of sibling closeness, and celebrations are held. Many a strained relationship, especially between siblings, have been mended during these times. When the sun had been close, it harmed many of the living things. There had been no death, so they lived on in suffering. Father Earth and Mother Waters mixed again, and created the End-Man who kills, and the new woman of procreation. Then the birds and beasts and the birds and the plants and the fish could all create their own young, and then the end man could finish them when they got too weak. They did not know that they had also created Matron Time, who brings change to all, by bringing the end man and the new woman. But Matron Time could not be stopped. They could not be affected by Matron Time, but all their progeny could and were, and Matron Time was also the goddess of weather, ever-changing. Others were born of their mixing, things beautiful and monstrous, benign and dangerous. They finally created humans, wanting to make something beautiful that could remember and think and move forward. At last, sated, they rested, with them only occasionally rising, with Father Earth belching angrily through a volcano, or Mother Waters creating a great storm. The world they had started ran on. And so there were a few eternal creatures, but lots of temporal ones. Humans advanced and multiplied. At some distant time, the era of monsters gave way to the era of man, and history began to be written down. The first people who reached the island found it lush and wild, with the form of small wild cat, wild goats, and many birds and small beasts to be found throughout. But bronze was not known then, and soon other peoples found the island. Some were friendly and settled with them or traded with them, but others were violent. The islanders had learned a few lessons of war by then, and there were gates where the bronze gate later stood. But it was made of wood. Though very strong, attackers would sometimes try to burn it after taking and looting the harbor, which did not have the large catapults, but only watchtowers to send word when ships were sighted. The wooden gates, though flammable, had been charred on the outside and made difficult to burn properly. Also, the gates were thick and had defenders on top. There had even been small holes made near the top for water to be poured down the front of the perfectly flat gates in order to keep any flames from catching. Still, on several occasions the wooden gates had been breached, and the city on the hill sacked and looted. In several instances, the first people of the island were taken over. But the original people managed to live on. In time, the usurpers were usurped, and those usurpers usurped again in their turn. The first people on the island were mixed with others, until their history was mixed up, and the people as well. In time, they simply saw themselves as the people of the island, and the several civilizations their people came from were at best distant cousins, not near or dear enough to be of much interest. And life went on like that, lifetime after lifetime, without much changing. But then a young man, Baran, made a discovery. There had been a copper mine found on the island long ago. While it was worked, and most of its profits went to the king, it wasn't so large as to bring much attention from invaders, or even traders. Most of it was simply used on the island itself. But Baran had found something special about a mineral. It was not terribly beautiful and not used in jewelry, but Baran, who was one of the king's coppersmiths, wondered if the shiny mineral held any metal inside it. He experimented, and by putting charcoal in with the mineral and using high heat, he could extract some white metal, which is not silver or another metal. The metal was fairly soft, and Baran had low expectations of the metal. It soon proved it could not make good weapons. But when he mixed it into copper, it changed the nature of both metals into something much more useful, stronger than copper, able to hold an edge better, and better suited not only for weapons but for many uses. It even corroded more slowly than copper. The priests, after much consultation, decided that this was a mixing of the metals akin to those of the gods, and the gods must have allowed it to happen. From then on, much effort was made to expand the copper mining and create a proper mine for the new white metals mineral, and bronze metal, later simply bronze, became much of the focus of the island. He himself became wealthy and powerful, and indeed his daughter married the king's eldest son, and his family passed into the kingship. While they were not a conquering people, they quickly discovered that would-be conquerors were almost immediately looking to take their island for the new metal and the wartime benefits it would give. They fortunately had already begun to wrap the wooden gates in bronze, as the metal was already called, and mostly for pride and religious purposes, not really for defense, but the bronze strengthened the gates just enough. The defenders of the island, though they lost the harbor once again, and lost indeed a fair bit of the bronze to the invaders, eventually pushed them back into their ships and killed many. The invaders brought with them their own future destruction, for of the several ships that had been left behind or destroyed, there were some with catapults. Taking the ideas from these, the island soon had catapults overlooking the harbor, and the island was stronger than ever. And so it was for nearly a millennium. The island slowly, inexorably, grew more wealthy and more powerful over time, able to hold off even the largest attackers due to their powerful armor and weapons and their ever-improved defenses. Their wealth also brought luxuries and necessities from around the world to their door, and allowed their merchants, in their turn, to explore the world with relative safety, for no one wanted to be cut off from the possibility of getting bronze. And the kings, deep in their luxuries, started to think that it would always be so. And that's the end of the episode this week. I'm having a lot of fun, obviously, writing this. If you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, CryptoBiography@gmail.com, or hit us up on Facebook or Twitter. And thanks for listening. Words and music copyright 2021, CryptoBiography LLC, all rights reserved. Characters and events are fictional, fictionalized, or satirical.